everybody. Thank you again for being here. It's the 8th conference of our lecture series, Connexions. I'm going to speak English because I guess our public is mostly Anglophone. I would like, before to start, I would briefly like to thank again the support of the Association of for Canadian Jewish Studies, the very Jewish Canadian Study Program at the University of Ottawa, le Microprogramme in Jewish Studies at the University of Montreal, et la FAÉCUM. It's thanks to their support that we are making all of this conference happening, and we are almost by the end. It's our 8th conference. We still have 2 more, one in May and the final lecture in June by Professor Jessica Roda. So I am pleased to welcome today Raphaëlle Bigras-Burrogano, who is currently in her 2nd year of her master at Concordia University Department of Religion and Culture. Her research investigates the dynamic of genocide, and in particular for her master, her investigation is directed towards the case of Nazi-occupied Poland. And that's what she's going to talk about today. And in her presentation, and in her research in general, special attention is given to the ongoing manner in which Jews and Poles conceived of themselves and others and as victims and perpetrators. So, Raphaëlle, the floor is all yours. You have about 30 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A by the end. It's going to be both in French and in English.
Perfect. So first, thank you, Valentina, for organizing this, and Alexandra, who couldn't make it today. So initially, my conference was about to be on the different shifts between perpetratorships and victimhood and the influence of Nazi propaganda on those identity shifts. However, my research has led me to a different direction, which is what my conference will be about today. So I had a specific hypothesis when I came into it, and I found, and I'll mention it later on, but I found enough sources and good sources to support that. But I also found a lot of sources which were contradictory to the initial sources I found, or at least presented a different narrative. So I thought it would be more honest and more interesting to view this from a more holistic view, if you want. So a large part of my presentation will be to discuss these complications, which I think are productive complications because they're providing me with multiple avenues to explore. So even if all of the results of this won't make it to the final product, which will be my thesis, I think my thesis will come out stronger because of all of these avenues and all of these inputs. So today I'll be presenting the first findings regarding the first part of my thesis, which is apocalyptic identities and the other Nazi-occupied Poland. In my thesis, I intend on answering the following question: which techniques did the Nazi regime use in occupied Poland in the attempt to define and exclude the other? The other is understood as a targeted group or groups with the specific goal of exterminating them. So in it, I examine the techniques used by perpetrators to create an imagined identity of the other group and exclude it from the realm of humanity and consequently moral obligations and laws. For this, I rely a lot on the work of David Mushman, who views genocide more as a crime of identity than a crime of hate. It should be mentioned that Mushman does believe that hate plays a role, but that identity is the central concept in explaining genocide. So Mushman believes that to see oneself as a person is to see oneself in relations to others and in relations to various groups. So this posits identity as operating to some extent within a binary, and that we need others against which we can compare ourselves in order to discover our own identities. So our identities are also shaped by our environment. So societal institutions, societal discourse, which surround us. Mushman argues that there are 4 steps which are required regarding identity for a genocide to occur. The first one is dichotomization, in which one identity is highlighted above all others, resulting in a perception that some people possess these identities and others don't. Following is dehumanization, where the other is removed from the realm of humanity and all of the obligations which come with that, which are then reserved for the in-group. Then follows destruction, which is the attempt for the physical and cultural destruction of a targeted group. Finally is denial. Denial can take multiple forms. All of us are familiar with Holocaust denial, but it can also be rephrasing certain concepts, so talking about disappearances instead of murders. It's also the denial of the identity of the victim and the role of the perpetrators in their destruction. So the reason denial plays such a role is that it's precisely our own identity as moral agents which forces us to deny the identity of the others. So to view ourselves as good people, we can't think of ourselves as killing other humans. So that's where propaganda plays in. So if we think of Rwanda, when they framed the discourse, they weren't talking about killing Tutsis, they were talking about killing cockroaches. So this aspect of denial where you can see yourself still as a moral person if you kill a cockroach, but not if you kill a specific group of person. So I also rely on the work of Lorenzo Di Tommaso, who's my thesis supervisor when it comes to apocalypticism. So as a worldview, apocalypticism operates, identity within an apocalyptic worldview operates in a strict binary. So there is no room for ambiguity or nuance. One is either with or against us. In a genocidal context, this sharpens the us versus them divide to the point where the two identities are reduced to stereotypical depictions. So in Nazi Germany, the task was to dichotomize identities so that only 2 would remain: the elect, which was associated with Aryans, and the other, which was associated with Jews and other undesirables, although Jews were the main target. So Jews in the early 20th century Germany were typically seen by others and saw themselves as Germans with Jewish beliefs or ancestry. So they were not defined solely by their Jewishness. Once Nazi ideology became
battery 50%.
Once Nazi ideology became the norm within society, Jews distinct group. So they were no longer Jewish Germans, but German Jews. Then Germany began defining itself in racial terms, so racial identity became the main or more important identity. Jews were no longer seen as German, simply Jewish. So Jewishness became their defining feature, regardless of their other identities or whether they perceived themselves as Jewish. So their perception of themselves was irrelevant. It's the perception of others which defined their identity. So then Aryan identity became the defining feature of humanity, and those who did not possess this identity were considered less than human. But because the characteristic of this identity were deemed to be inherent or natural, one couldn't acquire them, but they could lose them to some extent. So you can think of German political prisoners who were sent to Auschwitz, although they were treated much better than Jews. So to achieve this result, the Nazis use extensive propaganda campaigns with the goal of transforming the perception of specific identities within society. So the propaganda can be broadly divided into 2 categories: pro-German and anti-Semitic. So the goal of the first was to have Germans define themselves primarily according to their Aryanness, which was equated to racial superiority and purity. So in other words, they understood themselves primarily in racial terms. The second category, so anti-Semitic propaganda, Jews and Jewishness was depicted as the corrupting element of German society and an immediate threat to German survival and German identity. So they were portrayed as immoral, predatory, especially when it came to gender and sexuality because of fear of crossbreeding. So they were portrayed as being inferior not only racially, but morally, intellectually, and culturally. So in other words, they were the ultimate other, the complete opposite of the ideal Germans. So although Jewish and German identities existed prior to this, and so did anti-Semitism, propaganda created an imagined and diseased version of German and Jewish identities. So my thesis investigates how this propaganda was adapted to a Polish audience and whether it was successful in dichotomizing identities the same way it was in Germany. So the reason I picked Nazi-occupied Poland as a case study was because of its unique position in regards to defining identity, especially when it comes to the concept of the other. So Germans were perfectly well suited to fit as members of the elect and Jews as the other. Poles were neither a member of neither by default. So this distinction between who was a member of the elect and who was a member of the other was murkier, but also more flexible. So to illustrate this, we can think of the fact that Germans considered Poles to be racially inferior and that they intended to ultimately conquer Poland and settle it with ethnic Germans. But they made exceptions for Poles with Germanic ancestry. So those were mostly situated in a region which was then annexed to Germany. But we can also think about the approximately 200,000 Aryan-looking children, which were stolen all over Poland and settled in German families. And if I remember correctly, this happened in other countries as well. But we can see how then identity was more malleable in Poland than it was in Germany. And if you resisted that, so for the, I'm going to use the example of Wilhelm Brass, who refused German citizenship because he believed that he was strongly Polish, and also he was convinced that he was going to be sent and had sent in the army on the German side, which he wanted to avoid. And because of his refusal, he was sent to Auschwitz, where he ended up working as a photographer and then published a book about it. So we can see how Poles could become members of the elect if they aligned themselves with the occupying forces, but they could also be made others by resisting the regime. So I was interested in seeing to what extent the model regarding the German dichotomization and then destruction of identities would be replicated in Poland. So identity in Poland was categorized differently, both under occupation, but also in academic literature, which followed the occupation. So there's Jewish Poles, ethnic Poles, Germanic Poles, and there's other minorities. But in some academic texts, there's a lack of distinction, which sometimes leads to confusion regarding who were the perpetrators. So for example, some texts mention that the Polish police were brutalizing Jews in ghettos. Sometimes they specify that the police was made up of ethnic Germans, even if they were Polish. Sometimes it doesn't. But then when you have concluding remarks which involve the condemnation of either Poles or Germans, but no specific mention as to who were the members of this police force, this narrative can be used and adapted to suit different contexts. So, of course, these categorization and these differences were emphasized by the Nazi regime, who played one ethnic group against another, which led to specific racial hierarchy being created in Poland. So this was beneficial for the occupation on two fronts. First, they were able to prioritize the ethnic Germans, so who were considered racially superior. And then on the other hand, the division of the population prevented unity and solidarity between these different groups. And this solidarity could have potentially been used to resist and oppose the occupying regime. So the tensions between Jews and Poles were at an all-time high in the 1930s. So we could reasonably think that the Nazi regime, when they began their anti-Semitic propaganda campaigns in Poland, would be able to successfully rally almost the totality of Poles to their sides against the Jews. Although it's correct to state that a significant portion of Poles aligned themselves with the regime, either out of shared beliefs or fear of persecution, a group which I would characterize as larger than expected, considering the circumstances, but although still a minority, the Poles had a different reaction to this. So my initial findings regarding the success rate of propaganda was that they were mostly unsuccessful. So the way Germans depicted Jews in German propaganda did not seem to resonate within the Polish context. Furthermore, the Poles could not be included in the pro-German propaganda as they were considered subhuman, And in Germany, anti-Semitic propaganda works symbiotically with pro-German propaganda. So presenting one without the other was pointless. So although one could argue that the propaganda might have resonated with a specific group of minority Poles, so the ethnic Germans, I have not been able to investigate this further, so it's still an avenue which needs to be explored. So there are factors which indicate that the propaganda wasn't as successful. So if anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda, which aimed to have the Polish population view the Jews as other and as an enemy, and to have them rally with the German attitudes regarding that, if this had been successful, then the extermination of Jews in Poland would have been much faster, more brutal, and include a higher rate of Polish perpetration. So there's some academics who view this tendency of like identifying an enemy as having backfired on the Germans. So they think that some Poles identified with Jews as potential allies against the Germans. So instead of allying with the Germans against the Jews, they allied with the Jews against the Germans. This is a minority view in some academia. I've mostly found it in academics who tend to have a bit of an apologetic stance toward Poland. So it needs to be taken with a grain of salt and it needs further investigation. So one of the reasons which the propaganda also wasn't successful was that the Germans were exceptionally brutal towards the Jews and the Poles had to witness that. So some argue that this led to sympathy and humanized the Jews in the eyes of Poles, but also that the Poles feared that the violence being done to Jews was going to be inflicted on them later on, which in most cases it was. So this was also reinforced by Polish-German relationships. So in his book, Ordinary Men, Christopher Browning mentions that the Poles were to behave towards Germans as if they were the master race. And I quote, "For instance, when Germans walked down the sidewalk in town, Poles were to step aside. When Germans entered a shop, Polish customers were expected to leave," end quote. Furthermore, just as sexual relations between Germans and Jews had been made illegal, the same applied to Germans with Poles. So Browning again mentions that one policeman, and I quote, "spent 1 year in a punishment camp for violating the ban on sexual relations with Poles. The very existence of such a ban, of course, says a great deal about the reality of German-Polish relationships," end quote. So prior to Nazi occupation, Poland had the highest population of Jews in Europe, about 3.3 million Jews, which is about 10% of Poland's population. So although tensions existed in Poland, it was a relatively safe country for Jews, especially for refugees from Ukraine and Lithuania who fled there after pogroms. So in the years leading to World War II, the tensions between Poles and Jews began to rise, and there were two main causes of anti-Semitism in Poland. The first regarded the claims of defilement of the Catholic faith, and the second was the Jewish communist conspiracy. So this conspiracy was aggravated during the Soviet occupation and led to what Jan Gross called the institutionalization of resentment, where the Soviet used privilege and punishment to play on ethnic and religious differences between Poles and Jews. So this led to a surge in the perception of Jews as communist traitors, which led to mass murders once Nazi took over the territory which was previously occupied by Soviets. So a good example to illustrate that is the case of Jedwabne, which was covered by Gross in his book Neighbors. So Jedwabne was a small village in Poland where the Polish half massacred the Jewish half. And for the longest time, it was phrased and portrayed in Polish society, especially, as the Nazis having taken those actions. So it's important to mention that it was not an isolated incident, and at least 23 other cases of like similar events were documented. So there were also some tension based on nationality, but this does not mean that was a lack of meaningful relationships established between Jews and Poles. So I was also interested in the way perpetratorship was portrayed in Poland, as there has been a tendency in academia and societal narratives, so popular discourse, to focus on Poles as perpetrators and ignore or minimize their roles as allies of the Polish Jews. So this is notable when it comes to the plundering aspect, as one of the main ways Poles profited from the disappearance of their Jewish neighbor was through the acquisition of property and assets belonging to Jews who were sent to camps. So once these neighbors began returning home, they found themselves persecuted by some Poles who did not want to relinquish the acquired property. So therefore, Poles occupied this ambiguous space of victim and perpetrator, resulting in a conflicting embodiment of identities. So when Poles had to coexist once again with returning Jews, they faced the challenge of redefining their identity in relation to their Jewish peers. This was especially hardest in regard to where they would situate themselves and be situated by others. And by others, I mean their Jewish neighbors, but also the international community. On the spectrum of victim to perpetrator, and how this affected their own self-perception. So the tensions resulting from these interactions and perceptions are still very much felt in contemporary Poland, and inform the current discourse surrounding the Holocaust in Poland. So this was especially challenging for a specific group, which I'll briefly mention just because I think it's important. But Poles who sheltered Jews during the Holocaust faced persecution by Poles. So they often did not mention that they helped Jews. And in the case of Jedwabne, there was a family who sheltered 7 Jews. And once this was found out, they had to relocate to a different village. And when this was found out again, they had to relocate again. So we can see how this is a common theme. So regardless of whether they benefited from the disappearance of Jews or not, the Poles were under occupation and suffered accordingly. It should be kept in mind that the occupation of Poland was exceptionally brutal. From the beginning, in other countries, the Nazi regime had attempted to establish a type of partnership between their regime and the regime of the occupied country. But in Poland, the leaders were immediately executed, as well as about 100,000 members of the intelligentsia, which comprised the elite of the Jewish community. So the purpose of this was to avoid Poles organizing against the Germans and prevent opposition to the Germans' plan of colonizing the space. So because the Germans considered the Poles to be an inferior race, they saw them as being an option for basically Germany's workforce. So, but at the end, they were going to be eliminated. So we can think of them as Poles were being seen as tools. They were useful, but disposable. So there's no special effort made on the part of Germans to assimilate them or to treat them as equal as they had in France or Norway or Holland. So regardless of that, Poland was one of the only countries which had the death penalty for sheltering Jews, and it was extremely publicized and violently enforced to, and it doesn't compare to other countries. So at first, this was being applied only for sheltering Jews, and then Hans Frank, who was appointed by the Nazi regime to rule over the part of Poland which had not been annexed to Germany, extended it to people who provided a ride, even on a bicycle, provided shelter for one night, fed them, or even sold them food. And one of the reasons that this was enforced is they knew that Jews kept being sheltered despite the harsh consequences. So it should also be mentioned that the death penalty was not just for the individual, but tended to be for the whole family or every person that they could link to this aid that was brought to Jewish people. So my initial research produced a lot of sources which did paint Poles as perpetrators, or at least as people who were not very sensitive to the plight of the Jews under the Nazi regime. However, the further I delved into the research, especially when considering first-person accounts of survivors, both Jewish and not, although mainly Jewish, the more complicated the picture appeared. So these accounts are extremely revealing when it comes to the complexities of Polish-Jewish relationships during occupation, as well as the Polish implication in the persecution of Jews and in their role in saving them. So more relevant to my research is the reception both of these actions have had in Polish society and how they challenge or didn't challenge the narrative which were dominant in Poland at the time when it comes to victimhood and perpetratorship. So consequently, my research is now taking a different turn than anticipated as I explored these sources. So although my initial focus was mostly on how Nazi propaganda shaped identities in Poland, both intentionally and unintentionally, I'm now including a variety of sources such as Soviet propaganda, post-occupation Polish propaganda, first-person accounts, and legal documents regarding the trial of perpetrators. So just to point out the importance and the relevance of legal documents, again, I'm going to go back to Jedwabne. So when the perpetrators were tried, they weren't tried because they murdered Jews. They were tried, and I quote from Jan Gross's book Neighbor, as having acted in a manner that fostered the interest of the German state. And one of the perpetrators' his defense, and I quote, said, "Why do you keep me behind bars if I was not a German sympathizer, but rather a true Polish patriot?" And then he goes on and talks about his role in the Polish resistance. So the fact that the regime, so the Polish regime tried them based on you helped the Germans, so German collaboration, rather than you killed Jews, is significant. And it's telling about what was important to the regime and how the population also understood this. So I will be examining the similarities and differences these sources produce when it comes to perception of victimhood and perpetratorship in Polish-Jewish relationship and how certain tropes were perpetrated while others were abandoned. So I have not finished this line of inquiry, so these are only some preliminary findings. So I'll begin by presenting a brief overview of two main narratives regarding Polish-Jewish relationships, one which essentially views Poles as perpetrators and the other as victims. And both of these narratives had an effect in shaping their identities regarding categories of perpetrator and victim. And these shifted as different narratives were adopted. So it should be noted that these regimes tended to vary based on the political regime of Poland, but that they also intersect to some extent within academia. And those narratives are have been theorized by Doris Bergen, who is a Holocaust Holocaust historian from the University of Toronto. So the first narrative is Poles as arch-anti-Semite, which views all Poles as perpetrator. Bergen argues that this model might be emotionally satisfying, but it completely ignores the suffering of the Poles under occupation, which again was exceptionally brutal, and it erases their role in helping Jews. So the second one is Poles as victims or heroes of the Holocaust. So this focuses on the fact that Poles suffered immensely during occupation and that as many ethnic Poles died in occupied Poland as did Jewish Poles. And the numbers are often brought up by the far right in an attempt to equate Polish suffering with Jewish suffering. And even if the death toll is the same, we have to remember that the impact is not. So it's 10% of Polish population which was destroyed, but the same numbers represent 90% of Polish Jews. So this has produced important scholarship on the suffering of Poles, but also tends to minimize Jewish suffering and creates sometimes anti-Semitic tropes, while also creating this weird competition over who suffered most and who has the monopoly over the status of victimhood. So what lacks from this narrative is nuance. So there's a lot of generalization. So Bergen's actual work is very thorough and nuanced, but these narratives that she identifies are not. So I believe that this diversity can be found in first-person accounts. So notably, The Black Seasons by Michael Glavinsky, but because of time constraint, I won't get into that. So the point I'm making is that the majority of Poles, that despite the brutality and the consequences of helping Jews, such a high number of people continued. So if we think of righteous among the nation, about a quarter of the mention given by Yad Vashem went to Poles. So I'll just briefly mention the state of perpetratorship in Poland right now. So currently the Polish state is defined by an absolute denial of Polish perpetratorship. So it's noteworthy that it's the state which is endorsing and promoting this narrative of denial, as it makes it an official policy rather than just extreme groups within the society. So this is characterized by a few elements: a rise in anti-Semitism, a growing sense of national identity, and I should note that national in Polish has an ethnic tone, and Holocaust distortion. So they don't deny that the Holocaust happened, but they fiercely deny that their own ethnic group partook in genocidal acts. So it was the Germans and only the Germans. So this also led to an exaggeration of the help provided by righteous Gentiles. So how do you reconcile that with the rise in anti-Semitism? So Jan Grabowski, who works at the University of Ottawa, basically summed it up to the fact that it's virtue signaling. So it's not the fact that they saved Jews that's important. It's the fact that the Polish people risked their lives to do so. So again, by providing this additional information, I don't wish to absolve or minimize the violence of Polish perpetrators, but I do believe that a lack of nuance when discussing perpetratorship, especially Polish perpetratorship, is not beneficial. And I believe that because this is such a sensitive topic in Poland, making these distinctions while not minimizing Jewish suffering would be helpful in opening a dialogue. So we can wonder why the Germans were able to deal with their role in the as perpetrators and move on to reparations, while the Poles weren't. And an example of this is that when the reparations that the Germans provided to Jewish survivors was discussed in Poland as should Poland do the same, the majority of Poles were like, no, we should get money from Germany because we suffered. So I don't know if I have enough time to read a small excerpt to illustrate a point. Yes.
Yes.
So I mentioned personal accounts, which were important, and I don't have time to read one of the short stories, obviously, but Doris Bergen, in one of her books, goes over this brief account, and the title is telling. It's The Complexity of Polish-Jewish Issues. So in his book, Anton the Dove Fancier, Bernard Gottfried recounts a story that shows how the lives of Polish Jews and Gentiles were intertwined. When the war began, Bernard was a young Jewish boy who lived in the Polish city of Radom. His neighbor Anton was a Polish Christian who raised and trained pigeons. Anton was a rough man. He drank, threatened to cook his beloved birds, and neglected and scolded his wife. One day, German officials requested Anton's pigeons for the Reich. Instead of turning them over to the enemy, he killed every single one of them. He was arrested for disobedience and sent to a camp. Later during the war, Bernard himself ended up in the same concentration camp. There he saw Anton, now wearing the uniform of a capo. A capo was a prisoner whom the Germans had elevated to the position of authority over other prisoners. Many capos were known for their extreme brutality. Anton recognized Bernard and gave him some warm clothes and extra bread. Later, he provided Bernard with water, cigarettes to barter, and advice. Somehow, Bernard Gottfried lived through the war. While he was still in a camp, he learned that Anton had been killed by fellow prisoners in revenge for his cruelty. Gottfried returned to Radom, where he saw Anton's wife. She told him that she too had been born Jewish. As a child, she had been orphaned and taken in by Anton's mother. Anton had never known about her origins. Now she planned to leave for Palestine. So this case shows the danger of assuming clear-cut categories when studying a situation as complicated as that in Poland during the war. As Anton demonstrates, the same person could be a resistance figure, a perpetrator of brutality, a hero, and a victim of Nazi aggression. As his wife experience suggests, even the line between Christian and Jew could be blurred. there is little that is simple about Polish-Jewish relationships during the Nazi era. So I will conclude with that. My 30 minutes are over. So if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Raphaëlle. You stick to the 30 minutes. Congratulations. So it was inspiring, and it was very actual, I would say, even if we're talking about history, and it's always the case, it brings back to very contemporary conversation. And I was just thinking about the definition of the genocide that you gave at the beginning, and I was just reading this morning about what's happening in Ukraine. So it's really something that it's totally actual and contemporary. So the floor is open for questions. We have 20 minutes. Whoever wants to ask a question, you can raise your hand. Yes, Norman.
Hi, I've forgotten how to put up the hand using the gear because I haven't done many of these. But
you can
thanks,
use your phone.
Raphaëlle, thanks. That was very, very clear. And you covered a lot of ground, and yet still clear. So I'll just make one comment about the early part of your talk, which was considering the pre-war period and the sort of the contrast between the success of German propaganda at home and then the project of maybe bringing it to Poland. I guess I would just raise the historical context of the pre-war period. So you mentioned the 30s, but the key turning point, I think, in my mind is the death in the spring of 35 of the Marshal Pilsudski, so that you can think of Polish society as kind of beginning to break in some ways at that point, because he was an autocrat, but he was not an anti-Semite. So people fall to different sides around Pilsudski, but he was interested in a Polish multi-ethnic state. With his death, Polish nationalism had a resurgence, and it sort of modeled along the lines of things that we're familiar with that have to do with economic boycotts and much more strident activity in market squares, beating up Jews, messing up their stalls and things like that. So that's sort of the when we say pre-war Poland, or when we say 30s Poland, I would just say it's really spring of 35, death of Pilsudski, and then the possibility of emulating Hitler in new ways that hadn't been in play before. And it's messy territory, like so many of the things that you raised, but it's just the context that I would mention.
Yeah, that's one of the tricky aspects of like providing enough context that people would understand, but there's so much. Whenever I was like organizing, it's like, what do I include? What do I leave out? It should also be mentioned that Norm was very helpful in my presentation. His door was always open for me to come and discuss my question. So I will give credit where credit is due.
Okay, accepted.
Sean?
Hi, Raphaëlle, thank you for your presentation. Really appreciated its conceptual clarity and the emphasis on nuance and complicating the issues of categories, and especially that you ended on Bergen's point on that story. I'm wondering if you've encountered the scholar Tomasz Friedel, who has researched microhistory of Polish Jewish encounters during the Nazi era, and is very resolute on this nuance, and so really tries to go in a different direction in terms of the categories of perpetrator and bystander and that type of terminology. So for example, he writes, in the morally inverted universe created by the occupation authorities, the decision of its most condemned to seek survival meant bringing into orbit the lives of others. The relationship between the helper and the helped could transform over time into a two-way street between the denouncer and the denounced, the perpetrator and the victim. These are findings that will not satisfy those who expect a black and white history of the perpetrators and victims, heroes and villains. So very, very much in this vein of complicating the narratives, especially on the micro level, especially in rural Poland, where there was the Judenjagd, the hunt for the Jews, as Jan Grabowski called it.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the name, but I've been like, especially like in the last like few weeks, every time I like fall in a source, like 20 more open. So I will add it to my list. Especially it's nice to have like this, because there's such tendencies of having like strong academic stance one way or the other, especially like in Poland right now with like the hardening of like the denial, that it's good to have like an academic view that is really just like about nuance, not mentioning that yes, there were nuances and stuff, but that makes like a core argument should be like really, really interesting. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Is there other questions or comments for Raphaëlle? I do have one comment question. I really like, and I step on the fact that that San mentioned about bringing the microhistory and also the importance of nuance. You mentioned that, if I understand well, like one way of prevent this kind of generalization is to go back to first person account, right? So I was wondering, and I think I bridge it with my own perspective. I'm a sociologist and I do ethnography, so I'm really interested in what we in history we might call microhistory. So in people experience and track what they actually do in real life. But I was wondering, so how can we, after we track that, after we go and track for the micro, how can we generalize? Do we have to generalize? Is it worth it to do so? Or in this process, we will go back in missing out nuances that are so much as important, as you pointed out?
I think that in a context as large as academia, it's really hard to not have generalization. But I think that's like the importance of like those small accounts, but in finding like commonalities between those accounts. Right? So if you read a lot and they talk about how they received a lot of help from Polish like ethnic Poles, and then other aspects, there's true lines throughout, right? So, and normally what stands out is the complexity. So you can read a book like The Black Seasons, where you see very different kind of help, and like Jews helping Poles. So at some point you have this older gentleman who is Jewish but lives with this Polish woman who helps get people out of the ghetto, but then he ends up helping her as well because she was like an only woman. So he gives not a status, but like life at that time was more difficult if you were like an only woman in like a rural context. So there's all these types of exchanges. So like what I'm gonna try to see is if there's specific themes that you can find in those first person accounts, which could then be integrated into like academic discourse to make it more nuanced or more like well-rounded.
Thank you. I see. Somebody else would like to comment or to ask question? Or Raphaëlle, if you have specific question, on the contrary, you were mentioning to me that you are at this point where your work kind of changed and you were a little bit stuck. If you have question that you want to raise, or that's why we organize this kind of events, as I mentioned at the beginning with you.
Yeah, I think my main thing was I wasn't able to talk about apocalypticism a lot, as I mentioned to you earlier, just because it would involve going into theory a bit too much. But So the interesting thing about apocalypticism is that you have to fit within the binary, which works in Nazi Germany, but then has to be made to work in occupied countries. And as we see in Poland, it doesn't just organically happen. Like, it not just like, oh, the Poles are like, okay, well, we're with the Germans, and the Jews, you go to this other side. And there's, so like the narrative of the Nazi regime remain apocalyptic, but then in different settings, it transforms. So you have countries like, especially Nordic countries like Finland and Norway, which were pretty open in their resistance with less consequences. Of course, they were towards the end of the war, so there was always the hope of like the Allies are coming, right? But then it's how the interaction between how that shaped the apocalyptic view of the regime, or how that affected the propaganda they put on the ground. So I'm looking to see how like the influence of that as well, because it remained a core part of the Nazi rhetoric and worldview, but it didn't transfer. And I think they thought that they would go to a country and it would just work well, right? The machinery of destruction was well oiled and it would keep working without a problem. And when you study Nazism, you can see that there was chaos. They like to think of themselves as very like neatly organized and everything worked very well, but that's not the case on the ground. So that should be interesting. I think, again, first person accounts will be very telling about that.
Thank you. While you were talking, I was thinking about Italy. I don't know the history of Poland very well, but I do know the history, what happened in Italy. I am not an expert, although I work a little bit on that, but to a certain extent, I was wondering how we can compare the two contexts to a certain extent, knowing that they are very different, because there are differences that we need to point out, but the same a similar kind of discourse is also valid for Italy to a certain extent, because we did at le leggi razziali in 33, and then so we the divide in Italy was between fascist and anti-fascist. So we kind of have this dichotomies, again, view of that historical period between who was fascist and so was supporting everything, including the anti-Semitism and what it took against Jewish people, and on the other side, the anti-fascists. So that's they are portrayed to a certain extent, and soon is going to be the 25th of April, and we'll have the same kind of conversation again. We are portrayed as the one who we're opposing, but in the end, and the historical research that we have is enlightening on that, is pointing out that there is much more gray zone, especially if we look at what was going on in the life of the layperson.
Well, an interesting thing about Italy is that Hitler wanted them to enforce a lot of like anti-Semitism, and they were fine with it until it came down to Italian Jews, and then nationality was stronger than anti-Semitism. Not everywhere, but there were like tropes where like they were okay with like sending refugees elsewhere, like stateless people. And they did send like Italian citizens, like we can think of like Primo Levi, right? But it was much harder for them to cross this national boundary, as opposed, because for them the Italian state was important. For Hitler, the state was a means to an end, because he didn't want to create the perfect Germany. He wanted to conquer. So he wanted, which is why in his rhetoric you have him going like, we will rid Europe of this, right? It's not just Germany, it's not just the boundaries, because if not, you just send the Jews elsewhere, and then technically your perfect state has happened. And then like Hitler has criticized the Italians for not being anti-Semite enough, right? So it really depends everywhere. But normally, like those nuances are not even mentioned. Like, well, Mussolini was an ally to Hitler, so they were like anti-Semitic as well, but also in the same way. And it's true that they could, I mean, they were quite anti-Semite, but in different ways, which a lot of people don't think about when you think about like the occupation of like Romanian. What was the role of collaboration in Hungary compared to like Germany or Poland and all of that? So
yeah, and it's very interesting, as you said, the intersection of different categories. That's what you're pointing out. So not just ethnic, not just religion, we didn't mention, but to a certain extent it's there. Well, you mentioned it for the Polish, of course, and then divide with the Catholic, and then the nationality. So there is an overlap between all this kind of category that it's really important to take into the consideration when we zoom into each national context and then into the micro in the end.
Yeah, it's just very interesting to see like the different even things that you think are similarities, how they were carried out very differently. Sometimes they were carried out differently because people didn't really want to carry them out. So yeah, and I think again, like first person accounts reveal a lot, especially with people who did not intend to publish at first, or had like no stake one way or another. Like the Poles who published like right after the Holocaust didn't have the contemporary denial of perpetratorship in mind, right? As opposed to, and I had this discussion with Norm about like a documentary where Henrik Greenberg goes back to the village where he flew from. So he survived the Holocaust with his mother, and he goes back and asks questions to see what happened to his father and his son and his younger brother, sorry. And almost every single post, like, oh, I helped the Jews. And like, oh, not necessarily like I sheltered them, but like I fed them, I let them sleep in my barn for a day or two. So it's like, so if the entire village sheltered Jews, and how did they die? Right? You're telling me that like in this small village, the entire Gestapo went down? So yeah, so and of course it's the strange narrative. And then the reverse of that, as I mentioned, is the people who sheltered Jews were persecuted, and they had to like, and like for generations. One family mentioned that like their grandson, when he went to school, was called a Jew lover. And we're talking like grandson, like it's pretty recent. It's not like those people were like grandparents at the time of occupation. So yeah, so it's very interesting to see like all of those dynamics and how those people don't really still want to talk about it. Some people have considered there's someone who wrote a book as a follow-up to Jan Gross's Neighbor, and she mentioned that like she was considering relocating to New York City because of the harassment she faced. I wasn't able to find out if she actually did, but just the pressure, right? And she's like, I am a well-known journalist, so I'm immune from some persecution and some direct violence. Yes, exactly. But it was also, I think the book was We from Jedwabne, but I know sometimes the translations are weird. But anyway, so it's interesting to see that, and then we can take into account how there's a bit over 7,000 righteous among the nation in Poland, but how many were there actually if people didn't talk about it, or just the people who helped but didn't shelter for long periods of time, or to be given dimension, you have to have accepted no money. So some people who accepted money, and I don't mean like blackmailing the Jews, but some people who were like, the Jews would offer money because they felt like a guaranteed safety. Or some people were like, well, yeah, I have a family of 4 and now I'm hosting 3 others and I don't have the money for all of that. So people contributed financially so that they could also have food, but those aren't recognized. And there's like, again, levels, right? Between like that and people who would be like, well, if you don't pay me, too bad, so sad. So there's just like so many nuances and so many aspects that it's really interesting.
Good, and we are looking forward to read master dissertation to get even more nuances. I just want to point out, I said that the leggi razziali were in 33, but they were in 38 in Italy. So thank you very much. Our time is running out. Thank you very much, Raphaëlle. It was a pleasure to listen to your research, to your presentation. It was very clear. And I invite you all to our next presentation. It's going to be on May 18. It's going to be in French. Adam Mittelberg is going to present Pour une autre discours. Thank you again for coming. And we're looking forward to continue this kind of conversation, maybe someday out of the Zoom meeting in an in-person event.